we live? We are now. Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for comments from the Comptroller. Our guest today is a native Texan who has dedicated his life to serving other Texans in a variety of roles. His current role as Comptroller means he is the Chief Financial Officer for the 10th largest economy in the world and the great state of Texas. Please help me welcome Glenn Hagar. So nice and brief, like I promised. So Glenn, you visited us, I believe it was in May, the chamber. You're a good friend to our chamber, and we thank you for coming on. You have some, I think, positive news for us. Let's start with the first question. The BRE you provided in July showed a shortfall of more than $4 billion, while the revised one is downward to only about $1 billion. Can you walk us through how that evolved?
Yeah, happily. And just kind of for those of you that may not be familiar, to put in perspective, what is a BRE? It's what's called the biennial revenue estimate. And so the day before a legislative session, I am constitutionally required to estimate how much we think will come in the state treasury, one overall with both state and federal money, but more specifically, the number the legislature is very focused on is the state side of the dollar, the portion that they may have discretion over. And so last summer, unfortunately, after having a dual headwind in Texas with the pandemic, COVID, as well as impact oil and gas prices and the downturn in the oil industry as well, those things combined, we waited a few months to try to get some better data to at least get a glimpse of what was going on. And come July, we felt comfortable enough, at least providing a glimpse that for the current 2-year budget cycle, and those of you that just recall that when the legislature's in session, they put together a 2-year budget. As they're in session right now in an odd given year, that budget doesn't start until September 1 of 2021 and then runs for the next 2 years. So when I made that announcement last summer, that was talking about the current budget that we're living under, which goes through August 31st of 2021. So when we came back in January, thankfully, Texas entered into the pandemic in a much stronger footing than many other states. However, with that being said, as I mentioned earlier, we were impacted. And what that translates into since the time of July to when I revised it in January, as I gave them an update for the current 2-year budget cycle that again ends in August of this year. And the next one, yes, you're correct. We moved from in the current 2-year budget cycle having a potential deficit of $4.5 billion to roughly a little less than $1 billion. And what changed? First and foremost, we as consumers have been engaged in the economy stronger than what we had anticipated. So while sales tax revenues have been impacted to the Treasury, in other words, each month has typically been negative around 5% on average compared to the same month of a year ago. In fact, it was not to the levels that we've seen at the times of the downturn of the Great Financial Crisis or others. People are also engaging, as in buying things in and around their homes or purchasing much more items online. So overall, revenues came in better than anticipated. Again, even though they're negative, they're not as negative as we anticipated. Although, however, that means that severance tax collections from the oil and gas industry, as well as hotel occupancy taxes, unfortunately, they're still down double-digit numbers, but sales tax is roughly about 60% of all the tax collections that we bring in the Treasury. So all the streams of revenue are important, but the sales tax piece has a big impact to the state Treasury. So that's the first piece. Second piece is last session, I'd asked the legislature to look at a fairness issue because of a U.S. Supreme Court decision, how we can have taxability online items. And so therefore you there in the Clear Lake area, if you go around the local corner, you buy something from the local store, you pay sales tax from a fairness perspective to make sure that those companies that are online don't have a competitive advantage. And they also have to collect and remit sales tax. So when we originally estimated the legislature, we knew that part of the economy is continuing to grow, but the pandemic has really drove that area. And so therefore, in the first 12 months, instead of being about $500 million to the state economy, it was about $1.3 billion in the Treasury from a sales tax perspective. So that was an added plus. And then the last piece is, in fact, we didn't have some of the expenses that we thought we may have. So that also helped the situation. And so when I mentioned that $1 billion that has to be made up for this current 2-year budget that again ends here in about 8 months, that doesn't include agencies were asked to cut their expenditures by 5%. And that number comes in pretty close to what the deficit is in the budget. And then also we've received federal dollars in these different COVID packages. And so in fact, really pretty remarkably, Texas, we did not anticipate that we would probably have a positive cash carryover balance after the end of this current year, moving into the next year that starts September 1. But it looks that's kind of, as long as the economy continues on the trajectory that we had estimated earlier last month, we think that Texas, at least from a balance sheet perspective, will actually have a positive balance, which is really good news compared to where we thought we were ago just last July.
Absolutely. So the House and Senate have put out their initial budgets. How do those kind of compare with your estimates? And then kind of in that same vein, could there be another update to the BRE before the end of the session?
Yeah, so just yesterday I testified in the Senate, and I'm going to do that in the House next week. And I've mentioned the Senate yesterday, and I've mentioned in several different venues that, every couple months of data is extremely important. I started saying last March, when we unfortunately got into this situation, I kept saying a couple more months of data. But by last October, November, I was still saying a couple more months of data. So I started kind of calling myself out that if anybody's heard me earlier this year, I'm still saying that. And the point being is there's a lot of uncertainty in the economy, and therefore, what is the direction of COVID? What is the vaccine rollout? What is going to happen in other parts of the world? Texas is 19% of all the exports out of the United States, which is by far the leading export state out of the United States. And so therefore, I say that in reference just to make the point that we're very tied to the global economy. So what's happening with COVID, the vaccine rollout? Are there other variants that can have somewhat of a drawback in the economy? Obviously not to the level of last March or April. And so every couple of months is really important to get a better glimpse of the true direction that we're going. So if we are going to give an update, I will be updating the legislature there at the end of April, the beginning of May. And why? Because from a timing perspective, as they're putting the budget together, that's really the most critical time. Anything less after that time period wouldn't be helpful to them as they're putting this current 2-year budget cycle. So as a former member, I understand they're at the end of in the end of April, beginning first few days of May, that's when, if I'm going to provide a revenue estimate update, that would be the timing that I would need to give it to them.
Okay, great. What are some of the long-term concerns that you have that maybe, people aren't talking about that you'd like to maybe bring to light so that people can start thinking a little bit more long-term than just 2 years?
Yeah, I think several different things. First and foremost, what is our consumer behavior? We saw early on in this that even without government mandated shutdowns, obviously that has an impact on people, that has an impact on businesses, but people in general were hesitant, reluctant, out of concern, out of fear of COVID to engage in the economy. And so therefore, really, what is consumer behavior and what is that trend for the long term? How long are we having to deal with COVID to some degree, even once we have a widespread vaccination? Are there other variants that maybe the vaccines are not as effective towards? There's just a lot of things that we just don't know to this point. And so I think number one, people ask me what industry sector is going to lead us out of this. Now, every industry sector is important, but we're a consumer economy. And I think first and foremost, then, what is consumer confidence and how well we act and engage in the economy in the upcoming? And then really part of it is the impact that we can have, unfortunately, to certain industry sectors. If industry sectors that are in the hospitality, leisure, vacation areas, I'm frequently cite how many people fly around in the United States in airplanes, because we used to have about 2.3 million people before we had the dual headwinds last March, middle of March of the pandemic and lower oil prices. And even though right now travelers were somewhere around a little over 700, almost 800,000 on average, a couple of the holidays it peaked to 1 million, but that's still nowhere near 2.3 million. And so people's behavior has changed. Now, how long does it take for that to recover? So for certain industry sectors, much more concerning. Some industries, they're doing quite well. If you're in producing some type of equipment for outdoor activity, you can't produce enough equipment. And then what are some of the long-term supply chain issues from other countries as businesses are looking to potentially reshore into the United States from a supply chain issue? I think some of the supply chain issues, if we we have a successful vaccine rollout in the United States and other parts of the world, not the rest of the world is going to have that successful rollout as quick. And so therefore, those supply chain issues could be disruptive to certain types of businesses. And that's a little concerning as we're continuing to work through this and figure out how to make sure we get the overall economy going in the right direction.
So, and I said in the intro that you've served in a number of capacities. You actually were in the House and Senate yourself. How does this session differ from 2011, which I think that the initial fears was that this was going to be that level? And so if you talk to that a little bit, please.
Yeah, absolutely. So when I entered into the Texas House of Representatives, my first session was 2003. And so we had a $10 billion deficit in that budgeting cycle. In 2011, the one that you mentioned, we were entering into in the current 2-year budget cycle, which again ends in August of this year, but back in 2011, that ended obviously August of 2011, we had a $4.5 billion deficit. And then to maintain that same level of service in all facets of government for the next 2-year budget cycle, it looked like there was another $22 billion on top of that. So that was $27.5 billion, where this one went from projected 4.5, unknown of what the next one would be, to now we're really looking at about $1 billion overall. And so therefore, depending on the trajectory of the economy, we have growth of a little over 6% in our tax revenues estimated into the economy. We think obviously the oil and gas industry will take a little bit longer to recover. We think the state of Texas will return to pre-pandemic levels, which means growing at a faster pace than the national average. We probably won't this year because we have those dual headwinds where most states only have the COVID, they don't have the oil and gas. And so therefore we think next year we will get back to outpacing the national average. And so if you look at this one compared to 2011, 2011 was bad. It was worse than 03. In part, we did not fund public education enrollment growth, because every morning when you wake up, there's about another 1,000 people that call Texas home every single day. Half of that is natural growth, which means that there's more children in the public education system. So when you don't fund public education enrollment growth because you don't have the dollars for the first time since World War II, that was significant. And so this one, obviously they have difficult choices to make, but it is much more manageable than both 2011 as well as 03. But again, all that depends on the trajectory of the economy and you and I, the consumer confidence, and the direction that we're going in the upcoming months.
So do you anticipate the need for the legislature to address the rainy day fund this session?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Right now, thankfully, we're very blessed in the state of Texas that we have what's called an economic stabilization fund, or better known as a rainy day fund or a state savings account. Principally, the money goes into that based off oil and gas severance tax receipts. A portion of them goes into that fund. We didn't have it for so many years because Texas oil and gas economy was not that strong. Didn't know if we'd have much of an economy again in oil and gas. And then obviously with the proliferation of the shale play, especially in the Permian Basin and other areas, that fund has a significant amount of money going into it. I think at the end of last year, we transferred a little over $1 billion. We expect right at $1 billion for the next 3 years going into that fund. And so that fund has a little over $9 billion in it today. If the legislature doesn't utilize any of that money, if we were back in this exact spot in 2 years from now, it'd have a little over $11.5 billion. And so it's a very nice cushion to have as a tool in the toolbox when we have an economic disruption or a one-time expense, such as, unfortunately, in our area, we all know Hurricane Harvey had a damaging impact to the state. And so the state dipped into the rainy day fund, utilized part of that to deal with Hurricane Harvey. And so therefore, right now, I don't think the legislature will really need to utilize the state savings account to smooth out overall economically. However, they may use some of it for one-time expense that they see as just a particular issue that they're going to address right now that maybe they don't have the money set aside in other portions of the budget. So right now, I don't think they're really going to have to utilize a lot of it. They may use a little of it, at least currently on the base of the projections that we have today on the economy.
So you mentioned some sectors are doing better than others. One that I think jumps to mind that you see tangibly is real estate, but there's two sides to that coin. So there's residential, which seems to be booming, what about the impacts on the commercial side and the differences between those two?
Yeah, that's a really great question. If you look on the residential one, Texas has continued to grow as a population base. And so we were already, depending on obviously regions of the state, some were much tighter in the housing industry sector than others, but overall, we didn't have more than about a 3-month supply. Obviously, building process got put on pause in the beginning of the pandemic, has started back. There's some supply chain issues because of lumber prices and other products as a result of disruptions in processing. And so therefore the supply chain of homes is very tight right now in most residential markets. So that means prices are continuing to move up as there's really more buyers than there are potentially sellers right now for a lot of parts of the state. The good question, as you mentioned, in commercial, that's very different. Texas, we don't think is really going to be the same as you look at the commercial space in some of the other major metropolitan communities, such as say New York, Chicago, LA, as businesses and individuals are really redefining how they do business. Are we ever going to have the same footprint, say in my office, of all the thousands of employees going back into the building? No, we're not. But are we going back to right before COVID and March the 12th when we were fully working in the office? No, we're not going to go back to that. So it's going to be a combination. And so my point being is, in the commercial space, businesses continue to move here. They continue to relocate here. And so therefore that is a demand. Also, from a footprint size, some businesses may utilize the same space, just fewer people. And so I think from commercial, you're not going to see a significant contraction in commercial prices in that market. But I think the question becomes, are we going to have the growth that we've had in the last 5 and 10 years? And probably not. And so, at least immediately, we may not have the same growth in the construction area for commercial, but we won't see a downturn in that area like some of the other major metropolitan areas are. Again, really just based on the fact that Texas remains a very attractive state for people that want to relocate and or set a business up compared to some of the other states in the nation.
And in order to keep it attractive, you've talked about the need to continue some long-term balance sheet issues. What are some of those, and why is it so important that we address those now?
Yeah, I was just over in the legislature again in the Senate. I testified yesterday and testified today. Yesterday was on the economy and the revenue estimate. Today was more on my budget. But before I concluded, I mentioned some of those long-term liability issues. And, as a former member of the legislature, I understand their job is to pass a 2-year budget. And then there's a life cycle of looking at public education, higher education, transportation funding, water infrastructure funding, things that are very core and essential to a successful economy. Last session was public education, and they worked on incremental improvements for what's called our teacher retirement system. The one that we need to address is our employee retirement system, our pension system. And so Texas is not in the state of other states, say, for example, New Jersey or the city of Chicago with our pension systems, but it is one that we really need to put more focus on and make sure that we're not leaving an unfunded liability for future generations. And so, one of the points that I made to the senators today, the state has taken positive steps in putting more resources into road infrastructure, public education, different areas that are really critical. But I think I just need to continue to highlight, as the so-called CFO for the state, that employee retirement pension system, we need to make sure that we do more, that doesn't become a liability for future generations. And every time we delay dealing with that issue, if it doesn't have the funds necessarily to make it actuarially sound, it gets more costly every year that you go by. And so as I told them, this is not a year to essentially take the whole thing on, but to come up with a plan that can incrementally solve it over several years, I think is extremely important. And one of the reasons I mentioned that is Texas is a AAA credit rating state. We're one of the few that continually has that AAA rating. But the one thing that I think could be kind of a black eye, for lack of better words, here on the state of Texas, is if we don't address that pension issue in our employee retirement system.
So we've talked a lot about investment. You've always talked about the need to continue to invest in education in a smart way that makes good use of limited resources. Do you think they were able to fully do that last session, or is there some follow-up that's going to be needed this session to kind of accomplish that?
Yeah, one of the questions that everybody's asked is the commitments the legislature made last session, are they going to be able to keep those? And everybody that I talked to from all the members starting in March of last year all the way up to just to today, they all want to keep those commitments. I think, one of the things that we've learned, unfortunately, from COVID, one of the issues that gets talked about now more than ever, it gets brought up every 2 cycles. It may not be as big issue in the Clear Lake area, but other parts of the state it is broadband services. Typically that gets brought up in rural communities, and it was brought up as an economic development issue. But part of the thing now is because of COVID, broadband and throughout the state of Texas and access to internet connectivity is not just an economic development issue. Now it's also an issue about telemedicine. It's also an issue about education. And so making sure that we're able to educate kids. And so, where I'm going with this is I think they're going to continue to maintain the commitments they've made. But in the last so many months, the last year, trying to interface, do we have kids in school, those that want to take remote learning? Maybe they have, pre-existing conditions, family members in their homes, whatever those issues are, making sure that we have that connectivity so they're able to get that education level and we don't have some type of gap going on with some of our students. And so I think those are things that we're probably going to really focus on and address this legislative session. And so there's always something different that we need to address in public education that has come up, something that's changed or something that's highlighted an issue, but not fundamentally overall in the structure of public education.
Yeah, and so you mentioned broadband as a basically its infrastructure. And of particular area to us, of particular interest to our area, of course, is things like flood mitigation, highway, infrastructure. Are we going to be able to fund those? Because we have a lot of projects ongoing, and obviously those two are very important to this area.
Very, very important to the area. And, obviously it's amazing to me if you look at, say, for example, Clear Lake, expand that to the Texas Gulf Coast region. There is an unbelievable amount of economic activity that goes along the Texas Gulf Coast. Obviously, all of the Texas Gulf Coast is susceptible to hurricanes, which you never know when the hurricane's going to come, which one, even a tropical storm, as we all know in the area that we call home, is a tropical storm, parks over the Houston area for days on end, as Allison many years ago, can do significant damage. And so last session, the legislature took some positive steps trying to make sure we put resources into flood control type issues because it got highlighted. And so therefore those dollars are there. That effort is going to continue to be ongoing. And I think thankfully the economy did not contract to the level and stay at that level to where the legislature was in a situation like 2011 or 2003. Again, tough choices have to be made, but with that being said, they're nowhere to the levels that we've seen before. And so I think, they're going to be able to put a budget together and be able to continue to focus on a lot of these commitments that they've made and or focus of priorities as we've had in the past and continue to focus on those.
So I want to thank you for your time. I really appreciate it when our elected officials are as willing to give of their time as you are. Any final comments for our viewers that you kind of think they need to, if there's some nuggets that need to stick with them, now would be the time?
Well, one, I would want to say I look forward to being with you in person again. So I think we're all looking forward to that opportunity, getting down to Clear Lake area. It's a great part of the state. Look forward to being with you, and thanks for what all you do as a chamber. I think the most important thing is we all try to do our part. I think that's really important and critical that we all do our part to make others feel comfortable and feel engaged in the economy. I think Texas has a very bright future. I think, Texas is going to start outpacing the national average in economic growth, if not this year, by next year. And that all leads to you and I, the consumer, and you and I in business, and how we interact with each other and making sure Texas has a positive path looking forward. You're a critical, important piece of the state economy. Without individuals and small business, the economy doesn't function. And that's the reason Texas has grown for so many years. And I'm confident that we will continue to grow. And it's just always exciting to be with you as a chamber. Thank you.
Thanks again, Glenn. We appreciate it. So, as a reminder, we'd like to thank Glenn Hagar for joining us. Again, like I said, when your public officials give you that kind of access, it really is appreciated, and it's needed. That level is certainly appreciated. Reminder: go to the Chamber's website, clearlakearea.com, and check the calendar. We have a lot of upcoming opportunities to learn more. For example, February 18th, we have a one-on-one conversation with State Representative Dennis Paul, and the City Connections briefing on the 25th with Taylor Lake Village Mayor John Keeney. Thank you for joining. Remember to buy into Bay Area, and let's keep this economic good news rolling in our region.